adventurer, heartthrob, and incorrigible bachelor. That's how friends described Australian Charlie Carpenter, who at 25 left his father's house and headed to the shores of Canada's Yukon River in the grip of the gold rush. He remained that way until his last breath. Only his marital status changed. In 1904, the fortune seeker's ship docked at Desnev Bay in Chukotka. There, Carpenter established a trading post for fur trapping and met Pangea Tananik, but he would call her my Jessie in honor of his late mother. Their marriage was happy and successful. Interestingly, as witnesses who visited their home in the trading post described, it was divided exactly in half. Yes, one half was European, the other traditionally Chukchi, with furs, no furniture, and a hearth traditionally built into the chum, a Chukchi tent, as was customary among Chukchi tribes. Charlie Carpenter was head over heels for his Jessie. People said of their union, a case where love needs no words. The trader barely mastered Chukchi, and Pangea Tananik knew a few words of English. Yet the language barrier wasn't an obstacle. The couple had 10 children. In trade, Charlie Carpenter was an absolute professional. His trading post became one of the most profitable in Chukotka, and he was nearly the primary seller of the finest furs. Everything he invested in business, the trader spent on his beloved wife and children. However, not everyone believed in his good intentions. Some seriously thought the Australian was exploiting the Chukchi woman to legally establish himself on the peninsula. Charlie Carpenter is known from Tikhon Shumushkin's novel And the Flight Goes into the Mountains, and a film of the same name was made where Carpenter, as his prototype, is depicted. In the film, traders are portrayed from a negative perspective. He appears as a merchant, an exploiter of the local population, and his image isn't entirely historically accurate. However, the creators of the film can be understood. At the time, enterprising Americans were, to put it bluntly, hunting young Eskimo and Chukchi women. From Alaska to the Russian peninsula, it's just a stone's throw, and Chukchi fur was called furry gold. The demand for this commodity on the world market was enormous, yet only locals or those who married into the region were allowed to trap fur. So, some foreigners indeed had a literal skin interest. Marriage to a Chukchi woman meant a host of advantages, the first being the foreign trader's sheer survival. The fact is, Chukchi women, having grown up in this harsh land, knew the specifics of the terrain, the weather, even how to handle dog harnesses, reindeer, and so on. In short, a Chukchi woman possessed all the necessary skills to help someone survive the harsh Chukchi winter. In a word, the Chukchi woman became a guiding star for the visiting trader, a conduit into the local way of life, which seems strange to foreigners. After all, during fur trapping, one had to huddle in yaranga, portable dwellings of nomads and hunters. Covered with reindeer hides in 2 layers, fur outward and inward, the yaranga consisted of 2 parts, a cold section and a warm section. The cold section housed the hearth, while the warm section had a sleeping area. Since the Chukchi led a nomadic lifestyle, their daily life involved a minimal set of items, a fire starter, ritual objects, tools for processing hides, and utensils. Those very hide processing tools, for instance, looked like torture instruments to Americans, yet any local woman handled them with ease. Moreover, marrying an Eskimo or Chukchi woman was akin to marrying not just one family, but an entire clan, sometimes a very influential one. Such unions could thus be considered marriages of convenience, not in the woman's favor. It was, in a sense, an entry into a family, into a tribal community. Because if you married a local woman, naturally, you'd be treated much more closely. Not as a stranger, but as a relative, unlike if you simply arrived and tried to trade as an outsider. Consequently, in this context, Chukchi wives also acted as a channel of communication between their tribal community and American traders. But, to be fair, the Chukchi themselves gained certain benefits by marrying their daughters to foreigners. They received scarce goods from the big land without waiting: groceries, cotton and linen fabrics, fruits and vegetables. In general, the relationship became mutually beneficial. It remained so until the arrival of Soviet power. Foreign businessmen began to be persecuted, fined, their trading posts nationalized, despite some traders already considering themselves locals. This happened to Charlie Carpenter, too. In 1927, when the situation became even more heated, he, his Jessie, and their children boarded kayaks and crossed the Bering Strait. They had no passports and couldn't prove their citizenship in the Soviet state. It was difficult for them to live, especially regarding documentation. Initially, they landed on St. Lawrence Island between Alaska and Chukotka. Later, they moved to Alaska, to Nome. But there too, they faced problems with documents and passports. They took their children and simply moved to Canada. There, on the border between Canada and the US, they established their farm, raised poultry, and owned a sizable plot of land. In 1951, Charlie Carpenter, or as the Chukchi called him, Charlie Rednose, died. His Jessie didn't abandon the farm and continued her late husband's business. The descendants of the Carpenters still live in Canada and America. But among foreigners, there were those who, despite complicated relations with Soviet authorities, stayed in Chukotka until their last days. For example, Norwegian Ben de Vol, owner of a small trading post at Cape Heart of Stone. The Scandinavian's heart melted at the sight of Chukchi woman Tenat Val. She was very beautiful, with thick black braids. She was considered a beauty even among her own people. Documents show a marriage certificate between Ben de Vol and Tenat, dated 1925. But there's a note that their relationship began in 1906. That is, essentially, as soon as Ben de Vol started his activities in Chukotka, he immediately formed such kinship ties with the local population. Initially, the trader planned to build a house in Chukotka typical of a European, but he loved his wife so much that he sacrificed comfort for her happiness. Thus, he willingly agreed to a paradise with his beloved in a hut, making their family nest in the form of a yaranga, the traditional Chukchi dwelling. Dval's house became a haven for travelers of all kinds. Everyone knew the Norwegian and his wife would warm and feed guests. So in 1934, it was in Dval's yaranga that the participants of the Chelyuskin epic warmed themselves. At the time, the rescue of the Chelyuskin crew was trumpeted by the entire Soviet press. Ilya Selvinsky, one of the Chelyuskin's passengers, even wrote a poem about it, saying he would have perished if not for Mr. Dval. Such a comrade, who, as it turned out, lived in the farthest reaches of the Soviet Union with such an interesting background. The poem went like this: "Traveling through Chukotka, I was exhausted like a wolf, and I would have been in the grave if not for Mr. Dval." The evacuated Chelyuskin survivors from Olga recalled the warm reception they received. They were given hot water with soap to wash, fed stewed meat, and issued several sets of linen. In short, Mr. Dval was held in high regard by both locals and visitors. He knew English, Chukchi, and Russian, and of course, he later mastered Russian well. He was a very communicative person, able to interact with everyone. Naturally, people came to him for help. He could explain Chukchi traditions and how to behave with the local population for mutually beneficial cooperation. In Chukotka, it's hard not to become Chukotized because the conditions are unique. And of course, you immerse yourself in the local way of life. However, this didn't save the Norwegian from dispossession. Soon, he was expropriated and lost a staggering sum by those standards, 5,000 rubles. The trading post had to be closed. Yet, the foreigner remained in Chukotka. But soon, tragedy struck. While processing whale meat, he improperly set dynamite. The explosion severed both of Dval's hands, but even this didn't break the Norwegian's spirit. Dval learned to bake bread and opened his own bakery. In 1944, an influenza epidemic raged in Chukotka. Dval fell seriously ill and died. The white silence took the foreigner's health, money, and business, but it gave him the love of his life,